Welcome back. Again, I don't think we've had too many people walk in late, but again, my name is Dr. Steve Maxter, Director of the Vietnam Center, and it's now my distinct pleasure to welcome tonight's guest speaker, Socheata Poeuv.
Good evening, everybody. I really want to thank you for coming out tonight, and I especially want to thank the Vietnam Center and Archive for having me, and of course acknowledge you for being here in the audience this evening. And I don't mean that to be an underhanded compliment to myself. I know there are a lot of things you could be doing on a Thursday night here in Lubbock, Texas, and sometimes coming to a talk about genocide can seem like a real buzzkill. I don't know if you guys are too young to know who this is. Oops. Does this face look familiar to you at all? Sometimes I feel like I'm her. You know, I'll be at a party and people will ask me about my work, and I say, well, I started a nonprofit organization to document stories of the Cambodian genocide. And the other person will say, oh, wow, that sounds really important. I'm going to go get some guacamole now. And I just want to stop them and say, no, really, I'm a fun person, I promise. But at that point, it's a little too late. So I didn't always count myself as a genocide activist or even consider myself very much a part of the Cambodian community. But something happened to me several years ago that changed all of that. On the Christmas day that was depicted in the film, my parents decided to share a family secret that they had been holding for over 25 years. And the secret was that even though they had raised our family as this normal nuclear family with 2 parents and 4 children, we're not normal and we're not nuclear at all. And in fact, my 2 older sisters are my biological cousins who had been orphaned during the Khmer Rouge time. My brother is actually my half-brother from my mother's previous marriage. Her husband and daughter had died in the Khmer Rouge time, which made me the only child of my 2 parents. And in that moment, I realized 2 things. One was that my family was essentially formed by the Khmer Rouge years. The second thing is I didn't know anything about their history and therefore didn't know very much about myself and my own story. So it was that revelation, that's me when I was younger, it was that revelation that had me go to Cambodia and investigate the story of how my family survived the Khmer Rouge genocide, which became the film that you just saw, New Year Baby. When I was in Cambodia with my family, my father and I decided to go find one of the labor camps that my parents met in, and you saw that scene depicted in the film as well. So when I was investigating this film, I really had a hard time understanding what their living conditions were like during the Khmer Rouge. So I had this almost aggressive, obsessive desire to know and to learn. In retrospect, I think I had a kind of survivor's guilt for being the only one in my family who didn't endure the hardships that they endured and yet benefited from all the sacrifices that they made. So learning more and more about the Khmer Rouge became my way to kind of approximate their pain. So anyway, my father and I went to go find this labor camp, and as you could tell from the film, my mother has all the cunning in the family, but my dad is actually the one with a good memory. So he and I set out to find this place together. And I remember on that day, we were traveling in a vehicle on a paved road, and it was at the end of the day. The sun was starting to set, and I was afraid we were going to run out of light. I was really pressing my dad to try and remember any kind of landmarks. And he shook his head and told me, no, I'm sorry, I don't recognize anything. I don't remember anything. We continued to travel down this road when suddenly I saw through the trees this white concrete structure. My father pointed to it and he said, I think that's the old Buddhist temple. So we turned our car off the paved road onto this dirt road that was kicking up red dirt that was coating our windows. And when we got out of the car, it was a very serene and beautiful scene. There was this Buddhist temple there. Now, of course, during the Khmer Rouge years, Buddhism was banned, and monks were either defrocked or killed. This particular temple had been restored into a working temple. The sun was starting to set, and so there was this warm, beautiful glow over the land, and the trees had these pink paper flowers that were blooming. We were walking around this land, this territory, and there were no signs, there were no structures, there was nothing else to remind one that this was the site of a former Khmer Rouge labor camp. And then my father suddenly remembered, he said, you know, I think I remember where your aunt, Mala and Lakina's burial place is. Would you like to go and visit it? And of course, I said yes. And so he asked one of the monks where the site of the old latrine was. And this particular monk took us to this site, and I can remember standing there with my father in front of this wrecked concrete platform with 2 holes, which was the old latrine. And as I was standing there, the thought that I had in my head is, what a strange and undignified place to bury her. Why here next to the old latrine? And then my father said, you know, your mother and I have thought about returning to this very place and actually exhuming her remains and reburying her, giving her a proper burial. But seeing her now, she seems to be at peace. And so I don't think that we'll rebury her. And in that moment I realized that the reason somebody had buried my aunt next to the old latrine was that they could come back and remember her and honor her. And that example taught me that even though my parents, even though many Cambodians, most of them, don't talk about their experience of the Khmer Rouge, they don't tell their children what happened to them, they do want to be remembered, and they want the opportunity to remember their loved ones. And so after I made Me Your Baby, I started an organization called KHMER LEGACIES, whose mission is to give other families the opportunity to tell their story of survival and to pass that story on from one generation to the next. The mission of KHMER LEGACIES is to document stories of the Cambodian genocide through videotape testimonies. We do this by having the younger generation interview the older generation about the story of their life and the story of their survival. So right now I'll just share with you a short video about KHMER LEGACIES so you can learn more about it.
KHMER LEGACIES is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to document the Cambodian genocide through personal videotape testimonies.
Could you raise the volume on it?
Is that the younger generation of Cambodians are interviewing their parents about their story of survival. My family essentially was formed during the Khmer Rouge genocide. It was that revelation that inspired me to direct a documentary film about
I absolutely believe that teaching about, learning about, and understanding genocide can help to create a society that is more attuned and aware of these issues. That if another Rwanda or Darfur happens, if we as a society understand the issue of genocide, we can press our political leaders to act and intervene. But to be honest with you, I think that's a hope long in coming. For me, the real value in teaching about and learning about genocide is that it gives us an opportunity to examine the lowest low point of human conscience. Man's inhumanity to man is incomprehensible, except for the fact that it keeps on happening over and over again. Every once in a while, however, we hear of stories of individuals who commit equally incomprehensible acts of conscience. And we call these people rescuers. Rescuers are individuals who risk their own lives and the lives of their families to save others during genocide. So tonight I wanted to tell you the story of one rescuer from the Rwandan genocide. And as I tell you his story, I want you to put yourself in his shoes and imagine at every twist and turn what you would do. You know, at what point might you have given up? Would you have said, this is too dangerous for me right now, or right now I've got to protect myself first? Carl Wilkins is a man who I had the opportunity to meet several years ago, and these days he spends his time traveling around the world talking about the human cost of genocide. But in the early 90s, Carl Wilkins was 36 years old. He was a missionary, married man with 3 children who had been living and working in Rwanda for many years as a relief worker. In the early days of the Rwandan genocide, Carl and his family, which included his parents who happened to be visiting from America at the time, did what any of us would have done. They barricaded themselves in their home as they listened to the sounds of the war erupt around them. Every single night, they listened to artillery fire and gunshots go off in the night air. But within a few days, the US Embassy, along with other foreign embassies, decided to issue a mandatory evacuation. They basically told all US citizens, you've got to leave now, or else we can't ensure your safety. So Carl, of course, sent his family away to the US to safety, but he decided to stay. And the reason he decided to stay is because he thought about his housekeeper and his guard, both of whom are Tutsis, the minority group in Rwanda that were at the time being persecuted by the Hutu majority. And he thought perhaps if he stayed, he could help them. So Carl stayed. And in that moment, Carl became the only American to stay in Rwanda during the genocide. So the first 3 weeks of the genocide, Carl stayed in his home and tried to keep about 20 people alive, friends and neighbors. Pretty soon, so he realized that if he were going to help the other Tutsis in his community, he would eventually have to leave his house. Obviously, it would be incredibly dangerous for him, but as a foreigner, it was a little bit easier for him to get around. So one day, Carl was walking around, and he came upon an orphanage that usually houses about 60 children, which at this time was overflowing with over 300 Tutsi children. So he began shuttling food and water and supplies to them to keep them going. Soon the Hutu militia caught on to him and they began to intimidate him. They would flatten the tires of his car, they would harass him at every checkpoint. One day Carl woke up and found a bullet hole in his windshield. But he never quit delivering the supplies, sometimes walking on foot if he had to. One day Carl came up to the orphanage and he found that there was a band of Hutu militiamen that had surrounded the building with guns, poised to go in and ready to kill everybody inside. So at this point, I'm going to let Carl pick up the story.
The one American to stay in Kigali when the embassy closed probably saved more lives during the genocide than the entire U.S. government.
Mercedes station wagon. And as he got out of his car, I looked around, and here surrounding the orphanage, just materializing, it's like about 50 militia guys, camo jackets or camo pants, but all of them with machine guns. And I said to my Rwandan colleague who was driving the truck, I said, "Siphon as slow as you can, we gotta make this last. I don't know what we're gonna do, but it seems like it's not coming while we're here."
While his colleagues stayed at the orphanage, Wilkins went to the local government headquarters looking for help.
And the young secretary, I've become friends with, he says, "The Prime Minister's here." And I'm like, "So what's that mean?" And he's like, "Ask him." And I'm like, "Ask him?" You know, it's like that's the stupidest thing you could imagine, to ask this guy who is obviously orchestrating the genocide, a key player, and yet I had no other options. And door opens, everybody snaps to attention, and here comes Kalana and his group, that little entourage, and they're coming down the hall, you know, and I stand up and I put my hand out and I said, "Mr. Prime Minister, I'm Carl Wilkins, the director of APRA." And he stops and he looks at me and then he takes my hand and shakes it. And he said, "Yeah, I've heard about you and your work. How is it?" I said, "Well, honestly, sir, it's not very good right now. The orphans at Kasimba are surrounded, and I think there's going to be a massacre if there hasn't been already. Just tell them, you know." And he turns around, talks to some of his aides or whatever. He says, "We're aware of the situation, and those orphans are going to be safe. I'll see to it."
The orphans were saved. Years later, Prime Minister Kambanda would be convicted of genocide by a UN tribunal.
You know, the genocide is so complicated. I was in so many positions that could have been interpreted as compromising or even collaborating with the enemy, huh? You know, who's going to believe someone who goes to court and says, "Well, actually, I asked Kambanda to help me save some Tutsis." Huh? Who's going to believe that? The stuff in the genocide just turns, and that's why, you know, the thing about this is we got to recognize in each one of us, there's such a potential for good, and there's such a potential for evil.
So Carl went on to save another 100 orphans, and by the end of the genocide, he was helping hundreds of Tutsis escape from danger. By the end of the genocide, Carl had saved the lives of about 500 people. You know, I've often wondered what I would do in Carl's situation. Would I have the courage to save others? It would obviously be dangerous for me. I may even be shunned by my own community, which is what happened to a lot of people who were rescuers in Rwanda. And yet I hope that I would act courageously. Carl's story gives me hope that individuals can still choose virtue and life in the face of systematic government-sponsored murder. I'd like to tell Carl's story because it reminds us what's possible for human beings. I especially like to tell this story to students because you're at a time in your life when you're just considering what's possible for you. I know that formal education sometimes isn't the best place to explore what's possible. Elie Wiesel said that the Germans were actually the best educated people in the world during the time of World War II. The architects of the Holocaust were the heirs of Kant and Goethe. But what was wrong with their education? Why wasn't it an adequate barrier to barbarity? Well, in Wiesel's words, he says that their education emphasized theories instead of values, concepts rather than human beings, abstraction rather than consciousness, answers instead of questions, ideology and efficiency rather than conscience. Genocides are among the greatest catastrophes that human beings create. It's a failure of political leadership, it's a failure of humanitarian intervention, but perhaps the reason why we teach about genocide in schools is that it's a prime example of the failure of human conscience. Now, when you think of conscience from now on, I want you to think about Carl Wilkins, but I also want you to look inwards. I like to think of conscience as your secret core, that is who you are when nobody else is looking. You guys are just starting your lives, and I hope you can take a moment to appreciate how much growth you've engaged in the past few years. You're obviously growing physically. You're pretty lucky on that count. I kind of topped out at 5'2", but hopefully you guys, will keep on going. You're growing intellectually, and college is the place where your mind will continue to be shaped and stretched. You're growing emotionally. Some of you have had relationships, you've fallen in love, maybe you've been dumped. You have passions, whether they be sports or music. You know what it's like to win, to be disappointed, to fail. But there's another dimension of growth that we in our very materialist world sometimes ignore. And that's your spiritual or moral growth. You see, it's the combination of all four of these dimensions working in a kind of synergy that make up the wholeness of being human. And if you ignore your spiritual growth, it's like you're ignoring the wisdom of the ages. So some people explore this dimension through religion, through philosophy, through Oprah. Whatever it is, the path that you choose, I really encourage you to play in the realm of moral discernment. Play with the central question: how do I know what is the right thing? Some people think that the answer is out there for you to discover, but I think it's also an exercise of you discovering it for yourself. So here are some questions just to help you get started. What matters to you? And knowing what matters to you, how does it show up in your life? Once you've identified what matters to you, well, then you have a path, a way to direct your decisions. And if you can manage to live your life consistent with what matters to you, well then, as far as I'm concerned, you have found the secret to fulfillment. The most powerful people in the world that I know are the Carl Wilkins of the world, people who seemingly had no options and yet were still able to follow their conscience. People like my parents, who watched their families die all around them, and yet were still able to cling to their values of family, spirituality, dignity, and rebuild their lives anew in this country. So what I really want you to start thinking about is that the seat of your power is your conscience. Knowing who you are, what you stand for, and what difference you're going to make in this world. And if you can start to explore those questions in a serious way, that will be a tremendous source of confidence for yourself. Now, I'm not suggesting that you have to go out there and seek to change the world. Just be a part of it. And in so doing, I bet you will discover yourself. Thank you.